mist rises over ancient stones. Ruins that have stood for 1,000 years, silent witnesses to a history we've almost forgotten. This is the story of medieval Britain, but not the one you think you know. We remember kings and castles, knights in shining armor, tales of Camelot and crusades. But beneath these legends lies a deeper truth, a story of survival, transformation, and the birth of a nation from the ashes of empires. How did a fractured, war-torn island, abandoned by Rome and invaded by waves of warriors, become the foundation of the modern English-speaking world? The answer lies not in the castles we remember, but in the forgotten centuries that came before them. This is the story of medieval Britain's true origins, a journey into the Dark Ages that weren't quite so dark after all. Our story begins not with a beginning, but with an ending. The year is 410. For nearly 4 centuries, Britannia has been a jewel in the Roman crown. Cities flourish. Trade routes connect this distant island to the Mediterranean world. Latin is the language of culture and commerce. But in the great city of Rome, the Gothic king Alaric stands at the gates. The eternal city is about to fall. And in distant Britannia, officials open their morning correspondence to find a message that will change everything. The emperor has withdrawn the legions. Britannia must look to its own defenses. Rome is leaving. Imagine that moment. You are a Romano-Briton living in Londinium. Your grandfather served in the legions. Your family has been Roman for generations. The roads, the baths, the amphitheater, this is civilization itself. And now, the empire that gave you identity, security, and prosperity is simply walking away. What would you do? Where would you turn? How do you survive when the only world you've ever known collapses around you? The archaeological record tells us something remarkable. In some cities, life continued. The Forum in Verulamium, modern St. Albans, shows evidence of maintenance well into the 5th century. Someone was still cleaning the drains, repairing the water systems, keeping the machinery of Roman life functioning. These forgotten Britons weren't simply watching their world end. They were fighting to preserve it, year by year, generation by generation. But preservation requires resources, and without the legions, without the imperial tax system, without the trade networks that connected Britannia to the wider empire, those resources were running out. And from across the North Sea, others had noticed that the legions were gone. They came in the longboats, Angles from Denmark, Saxons from northern Germany, Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula. Warriors, yes, but also farmers, families, entire communities seeking new land. Remember our question: how did this fractured island become a unified realm? The paradox is this: it began with invasion, with the very forces that seemed destined to destroy any hope of unity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written centuries later, describes these invasions in stark terms: battles, massacres, cities burned. But archaeology tells a more complex story, one of gradual settlement, of intermarriage, of cultural fusion. Modern genetic studies reveal something unexpected. The Anglo-Saxon invasion wasn't a wholesale replacement of the British population. In many regions, the DNA shows continuity. Romano-British people didn't disappear. They adapted. They survived. They became something new. Think about what that means. A British farmer in Kent, watching Saxon settlers clear the next valley. His great-great-grandchildren might speak a Germanic language, worship Germanic gods, identify as Saxons, but they would carry his blood. His survival strategy wasn't resistance. It was transformation. By the year 500, the map of Britain had been redrawn. The western kingdoms, Wales, Cornwall, parts of the north, remained British, speaking languages descended from the ancient Brittonic tongue. But in the east and south, a new culture was emerging: Anglo-Saxon England. The cities of Rome fell silent. Londinium, once home to 50,000 souls, shrank to a few hundred. The Forum crumbled. Weeds grew through the mosaic floors. For 2 centuries, it would barely exist. This is the period we call the Dark Ages, not because people lived in darkness, they didn't, but because the written record grows thin. The light of literacy, that gift of Rome, flickered and dimmed. What stories vanished in those silent centuries? What songs were sung that we'll never hear? What wisdom was lost when the last Romano-Britons who could read Latin closed their books for the final time? But darkness is never absolute, and in this darkness, something extraordinary was about to kindle a new light. The year is 597. On the coast of Kent, 40 monks wade ashore from their boats. They are led by a man named Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great with an impossible mission: convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Legend tells us that Gregory first conceived this mission years earlier, when he saw fair-haired Anglo-Saxon slaves in a Roman market. Not Angles, but angels, he supposedly declared. The story may be apocryphal, but the mission was real. Augustine and his monks must have been terrified. They were walking into warrior kingdoms where human sacrifice still occurred, where pagan priests held tremendous power, where the very idea of a god who preached forgiveness and humility would seem absurd. Just what happens when 2 completely different worldviews collide? When the warrior culture of the Germanic tribes meets the spiritual discipline of Mediterranean Christianity? Something unexpected, something that would shape Britain forever. King Ethelbert of Kent agreed to meet these strange monks. Perhaps he was curious. Perhaps his Frankish wife, already a Christian, influenced him. Whatever the reason, he listened to their message, and he converted. This wasn't a simple matter of changing gods. Christianity brought with it something the Anglo-Saxons desperately needed: writing. The return of literacy. The ability to record laws, treaties, land grants, all the machinery of stable governance. Remember of lost knowledge of Rome? Christianity was bringing it back. Monasteries became libraries. Monks copied manuscripts. Schools opened. The light that had dimmed was growing bright again. Within a century, Christianity spread throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Monasteries arose at Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Whitby. These weren't just religious centers, they were universities, scriptoria, centers of art and learning. At Jarrow, a monk named Bede wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people. For the first time, someone was recording not just events, but a coherent narrative, the story of how these various kingdoms were becoming a people. Becoming English. The birthed people of this island stop being Romans, Britons, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and start being English. The answer isn't a date, it's a process, and Christianity was the catalyst. But this fragile new Christian civilization was about to face its greatest test. June 793. The monastery at Lindisfarne, a jewel of Christian learning on a holy island off the Northumbrian coast. Monks at their prayers, manuscripts being copied in the scriptorium. Peace, devotion, sanctuary. Then the dragon ships appeared. The Vikings struck without warning. They killed monks where they prayed. They smashed reliquaries, stole holy treasures, burned buildings. The survivors spoke of it in terms of apocalypse, as if the end of the world had come to their peaceful shore. The scholar Alcuin, safe in Francia, wrote letters of anguish. "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain," he wrote. "Who would have believed that the heathen would come and desecrate God's sanctuary?" Number 3. Invasion again. Britain had survived one wave of Germanic invaders who became the Anglo-Saxons. Now, 3 centuries later, another wave was coming from Scandinavia. Would the pattern repeat? Would these Vikings too settle and transform? The difference was the scale. The Vikings didn't just raid, they conquered. Within decades, they had destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. They established their own realm, the Danelaw, where Norse law and customs held sway. By 870, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained free, Wessex in the south, and even Wessex teetered on the brink of destruction. Everything, the Christian civilization, the emerging English identity, the monasteries, the learning, all of it seemed destined to drown in the Viking tide. And then a young king came to the throne who would refuse to let it end. His name was Alfred. History would call him the Great, the only English monarch ever to earn that title. But in 871, he was just a 22-year-old prince inheriting a kingdom at war. Alfred fought battle after battle, winning some, losing others. In 878, the Danes nearly destroyed him utterly. He fled to the marshes of Somerset with a handful of loyal followers. The kingdom seemed lost. But Alfred regrouped. He rallied his forces. At the Battle of Edington, he won a decisive victory that saved Wessex. More importantly, he won the peace that followed. Remember the birth of English identity? Alfred didn't just save a kingdom. He gave the English people a unified vision of themselves. He promoted education, translated important works into English, established a legal code, built a network of fortified towns called burhs. He even began a project of historical writing, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, to record the story of his people. Alfred understood something crucial. A people without a story is just a collection of individuals. A people with a shared story becomes a nation. Alfred died in 899. Wessex survived, but Britain remained divided between English and Danish realms. The Viking threat wasn't over. His descendants would spend the next century fighting to unite the island under one crown. And in that struggle, medieval England would finally, truly be born. In 927, Athelstan achieved what no one before him had managed. He became the first king to rule all of England. Not just Wessex, not just the English kingdoms, all of England. What does it mean to be a king of a unified realm? Not just a war leader, not just the strongest thane, but the embodiment of a nation. Athelstan understood the power of symbols. He held great councils where nobles from all regions came together. He commissioned legal codes that applied throughout the realm. He collected relics and manuscripts, building a cultural identity for his kingdom. He even styled himself King of the English, not King of Wessex, not King of Mercia, but King of a people who were becoming one. King Ethelred, history would unfairly call him the Unready, tried to buy them off with tribute. It didn't work. The institutions Alfred and his successors built proved resilient. Two armies face each other across a field that will change British history forever. A shield locked in the ancient shield wall. William's Norman cavalry charged again and again, breaking against that wall like waves on rock. The Normans didn't replace English civilization, they fused with it. It gave England a level of bureaucratic organization that would make it the most efficiently governed kingdom in Christendom. Peasants in hovels, darkness, and superstition. But the reality was far richer, far stranger, far more complex. They were statements of confidence, wealth, and faith. A single cathedral could take a century to build, employing hundreds of craftsmen. But the foundations laid in those forgotten centuries, from Alfred's Wessex to the Norman kingdoms, those foundations held. They hold still. We walk paths they carved. When we debate in Parliament, we inherit their arguments about power and justice. The Middle Ages are not as distant as we think. The medieval world is not as foreign as we imagine. The next time you see an old church, its stones worn smooth by centuries of weather and prayer, stop for a moment. Imagine the hands that placed those stones, the people who worshipped there, the generations who kept that building standing through plague and war and change. They are not forgotten, not entirely, not while we remember to ask their story. This has been the story of medieval Britain's forgotten origins, of collapse and survival, of invasion and integration, of darkness and enlightenment, of 1,000 years that forged a nation and changed the world. The mist rises over ancient stones, silent witnesses, but we have heard their testimony, and now